So we did want to mention to folks too, is that if you're doing this activity and it's triggering some painful stuff for you because you felt the effects of oppression on some of those identities, we certainly don't want that to happen. We want this to be an activity that's hopefully a positive one, but we certainly recognize that if you've had instances of oppression, discrimination, harassment, abuse around as an aspect of your identity, you can certainly walk away from either that category or the activity and think about taking care of yourself. We certainly don't want this to be, the effects to be harmful, but sometimes you don't even anticipate that necessarily as you're doing the exercise. It may bring up stuff that you think initially when you just look at the grids, oh, sure, this will take me 10 minutes. And then it'll hit something emotionally. I'm DA Dirks, and I was a member of NP Madison. I now am in Calgary. I use they, them pronouns. We can talk more about that in a minute. And so I've used this social identities activity for years in different settings for different organizations and in my classrooms that I teach at the university level. And I find it's been helpful in terms of having conversations around complex social identities, because we're never just one thing. Like, we're never just a member of NP. That's important. But we also have lots of other social identities that we bring to the table that are important to us, and that may be important to us and may not even be visible to other people, or something that people may judge us about without us even opening our mouths. People may look at us and make a judgment based on one of our social identities. So I think it offers the opportunity for some important conversation around social identities and what they mean to us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Somia. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, have been a long-time member of Madison's NP, and that's actually where I met DA, probably 4 or 5 years, or maybe even 6 years ago. So we obviously love the November Project. We were so excited to be able to do this at the Meeting of the Minds with leaders last year in Seattle, and we also are so excited to have 4 leaders who didn't go through it then, but are willing to kind of demonstrate it for the world here. And so thank you so much to all of you for being here. And just echoing what DA said, that November Project has kind of put it out there that their North Star is now kind of decentering whiteness and decentering white supremacy in their organization and in their practices. And so this is a really great place to start. Some of the things that we take for granted, some of the forces that we feel, they are kind of filled with white supremacy, or they have been kind of carved by white supremacy. And so this gives us an opportunity to hold up a mirror to that. And so excited to be able to model this and demonstrate this all together. Created a few documents that can help aid people if they wanted to do this individually or in pairs or small groups. And so one of the documents that will be available to people is that social identity grid. And so we are going to go over that and kind of explain how it's set up and maybe some common questions that we get. There's also a document that talks about what are the learning objectives, what's the format, and so that will also be available for people to look at if they were wanting to do this on their own and how to move forward with that.
For an organization like NP, which I think we've talked about, this is predominantly white membership, to decenter whiteness, what does that look like in terms of an organization that may have more members that are white? How do you decenter whiteness within your practices? Because that's important. And I think also just having conversations across identities means that people can share, be vulnerable, see where they have privilege, see where they lack privilege, and how that it's not just, oh, the cis het white guy, Boyan, has all the privilege, and somebody else in the group may lack all the privilege. You definitely bring some privilege to the table, my tall white cis het friend. But there's other places where I think you shared with us some vulnerability around where you feel a lack of privilege as well. So those are important conversations to have too, I think.
Learning objective of the social identities grid helps us explore our social identities, how we understand them and value them, and how they guide us through thinking about how others see us and also what impact those judgments and perceptions have on us as individuals. And like DA said, we're all complex people with complex intersecting identities. And this exercise helps us honor that and also start to untangle the kind of the societal forces that are at play that we know are at play. So you'll note on the social identities grid that it's set up like a grid. On the left column are categories, and across the top are some ways to think about your identities in these categories. And so under the categories, there's a little blank spot. So there's like race, ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic status, and then there's a little blank spot for you to be able to fill in how you identify under that category. Across the top, though, are that's kind of the most fun, intriguing part of this exercise is thinking about the different ways that you look at and evaluate and can think about your identity. So the first one there that's listed towards the left is importance. And so really we're here asking you, how important is this identity to you? And we're asking you to evaluate that on a scale from 1 to 10. So 1 is not at all important and 10 is extremely important. If you move over to the next column there, it's about how apparent this identity is to you. And so we're asking you to consider, when someone who sees you in passing or doesn't know you very well, how much will they be able to tell that you identify in this way? 1 would mean that it's not at all apparent, 10 is extremely apparent. The next column over is how regarded is this identity. So how, and this is in your opinion, how highly regarded is this identity by society as a whole? 1 to 10 scale again. And here you're kind of evaluating those oppressive forces that may or may not be at play. Word privilege. And so do you have privilege in this area? Is there an oppressive force historically or currently that impacts how regarded this identity is by society? The last column on the very right is, how does this identity affect you? We were asking you to consider, is it viewed positively or negatively? Is it a mix? Is it complicated? So how does this identity impact you as an individual?
So we wanted to maybe provide a little bit of explanation for some of the categories. Some may seem fairly straightforward, but then as you're sitting down thinking about it, you may ask yourself, well, I'm not 100% sure I know what this means. So we'll jump around a little bit because it's kind of dull to just march through this grid in order. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of categories, one called sex assigned at birth, and the other one called gender identity and gender expression. So sex assigned at birth is sort of a legalistic term, but what it means is that usually when babies are born, a doctor or a midwife will look at the baby and say, it's a boy or girl, usually, although there are intersex humans. And so that's usually what's on your driver's license, your passport, official government documentation will have the categories male or female. And you don't have any control over that. That's kind of the official, what kind of categories that are legally important to say. But they're also limiting to a binary of just male or female. And some places have a third option, an X or a different category, just recently starting. So that affords a bit more opportunity. But sex assigned at birth, generally most people would say male, female, but there are other options. Gender identity and gender expression. Well, I can use myself as an example. My gender identity is non-binary. I use they, them pronouns, although not all non-binary people use they, them pronouns. I choose to use they, them pronouns. And so that means on the transgender sort of spectrum of humans, I identify as a non-binary trans person because I don't identify with the sex that I was assigned at birth. I identify in a way that's neither really male or female. And so what does that mean for my gender identity? What does that mean for my expression? But sometimes I express my gender identity, my internal sense of what my gender is. Externally, I'll manifest it in what I would say as a more masculine expression or a more feminine expression, or maybe a kind of combo androgynous expression. And so that's a complicated identity, right? And so it's important to me as part of my identity to talk about my non-binary sense of who I am. Is it apparent to people? Well, sometimes people will sir me because I have short hair, and if they're standing behind me, they may make an assumption. I don't mind that because I have an ambiguous gender expression. How is it regarded? Well, we know politically in the day and age that we live, trans people may be more or less well regarded depending on various social, cultural, and political situations. So I've definitely felt that as an oppressive piece of my identity because I have had discrimination directed at me, slurs directed at me, attacks directed at me. And so I feel that as a more salient part of my identity because it's one that I feel is also potentially an oppressed identity. And it affects me, right? I mean, I'm proud, I'm out, but sometimes people put negative judgments on that piece of my identity. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk a little bit more about it today.
Another identity or category that we want to expand upon a little bit is around race and ethnicity and culture. This feels really important to the conversation that we're having now and recently and always, because of kind of the kind of the reckoning that white folks are having around racial injustice in the United States of recent. And so, again, this is kind of listed really first up there, and we wanted to share a little bit more information about it. So one thing to understand off the bat is that race is socially constructed. So kind of biologically and genetically, there's not a lot of difference between people across races. There's actually more difference between people than we can make these gross assumptions about how people are constructed genetically and biologically. Because of racism, race emerged. And so those kind of go hand in hand together. I'm going to, again, like DA, use myself as an example to walk through the social identity grid. And so I identify as an Asian woman, as a woman of color. My parents are immigrants from India, and so being Indian and being Indian American is really important and integral to who I am. And so that's that first column that's written there. How important is this to you? I don't know how to be in this world without being a woman of color, without being Indian. And so that's how I walk through this world. That identity becomes more and more salient or differently based on where I am. And so when I'm in my family, around family members who look like me, that kind of salience of that identity drops. When I am in predominantly white spaces, so I live in Madison, Wisconsin, I used to work at a predominantly white institution, that kind of how I think about myself as a woman of color, as an Indian woman, I become more hyper aware of it. And it's kind of elevated. How apparent? So this is really apparent. My skin is darker than white people who might be near me. And so people automatically know that I'm not white. And so it's very apparent, extremely apparent. And then when we go to that third column there around how highly regarded is this, I think it's important to talk about colorism when we're talking about race. So I experience a certain level of oppressive forces by being a person of color. And it's also incredibly important for me to recognize that Black and Indigenous folks in our community experience more racism, more oppressive forces as a result of that kind of historical component. The colorism and the different oppression that occurs for people who identify as Black, Indigenous people of color and how that varies, that's a complicated thing that I know a lot of people are chewing on, unpacking for themselves, but it feels really important to not only acknowledge that I'm oppressed, but also I know that other identities and other groups and other communities are oppressed even more because of that kind of historical intergenerational component. And how does this affect you? This is kind of when we're thinking about impact and race and ethnicity. Like I said earlier, I don't know how to walk in this world without being an Indian woman. And those are really connected. And as some of you all are filling these social identity grids out, you'll start to know that some of your identities intersect. And that's what we mean about intersectionality, is how do those overlap, and how does privilege or oppression also intersect?
For somebody like me who is the child also of immigrants, but of German immigrants to Canada, I definitely felt some impacts around, my parents have accents. but they are European, right? And they have white privilege around that being European Canadian immigrants versus some of the other cultures and communities that have immigrated to Canada. And so I definitely feel like I don't necessarily have to think about my whiteness very much because I function in the world where that's actually looked upon with maybe not even consciously, but it's looked upon as a positive, right? And so that to me, my whiteness isn't very salient because I move through the world not having to think about it very much because it affords me privilege. And so I would say, what is my whiteness important to me? Well, I'm a conscious, racially conscious, or conscious around racialization and racism, but I also reap the benefits of my white privilege, not consciously often as I move through the world. My tired old joke is towards the end, you'll see parental status. And I will say that's not, do you have parents? Because yes, you do. The question is, what's your status as a parent? Like, are you a parent? Not, do you have parents? So that's what parental status means. It's one of those, again, sort of ambiguous kind of wordy words, phrases that may not be clear, but it's asking, are you a parent? Are you a caregiver of young people? So.
My only question would be around membership in social organization of like, so yes, but does that mean multiple? What kind? Or, like, is that up to our interpretation as well?
I always talk about November Project, right? To me, that's a social organization that I'm in that's very important to me. Sometimes when I do this with working people, I'll ask them, are they a member of a social organization or something that they volunteer with that's important to them? With students, I'll ask, are you a member of a student organization or club on campus? So I would say, just like, what's important to you? Like, if you're giving your personal time to something, it's probably important to you. And so how is that meaningful for you? So I would say you could mention a couple of things if you want. You could keep it to one thing. That's the ability that you have to kind of be flexible in terms of how you answer the grid. Some of these may read as a bit vague or ambiguous too, like things like size or appearance. You might be like, well, what does that mean? And it's really about, I think Somya actually gave a good description of this the other day in terms of kind of what that means to you personally about your physical kind of shape and how you operate in the world and how other people see you. Somya, did you want to maybe elaborate a bit on that?
When we were talking about size and shape, I think we can acknowledge that there are some normative standards of beauty that are present in your community, present across your identities and in your family and kind of in the larger media. And so you're asking yourself, how does that compare? How does that interact with those normative standards of beauty? And as a person who identifies as a woman, I've gotten really strong messages about who I am and how I look, how that meshes or does not mesh, or how I should change or be different with those standards of beauty and standards of what I should look like. And so that's a kind of a big category there. And some of those oppressive forces are some of the things that we've already mentioned, like DA talked about gender expression, like there's a lot of policing about how you look and how you should look, and how that might intersect with gender expression. Also, some of the fat phobia that is really rampant in kind of in our culture around, and how that's connected to health or not connected to health. So people have strong ideas around that. And so it's a big kind of category, but those are some of the things that we're asking you to consider.
And maybe because November Project is global, right? The question around use of English might be more relevant in a North American context than in the rest of the big, beautiful world that we live in, right? But in a North American context, for example, if you speak unaccented English, or if English is your first language, that might afford you some privilege as soon as you open your mouth and people hear you.
I guess one reaction or question I have is I'm looking at this chart and I'm seeing the effect column with very small boxes. And I'm wondering, there's a lot you can share in that. So I'm just wondering if you can keep it to positive effect, negative effect, or folks generally expand on a bit more context in that space.
So depending on how you work with it, like if you work with a printed out physical copy, you can turn that baby over and write an essay if you feel like you need to do that, or if you're in an expandable, fillable in PDF, you can write an essay in whatever format. And I think it's complicated, right? Like, because some of these categories might have, as we said, positive, more negative, a mix of both. It may change over time depending on where you're at in your life, or geographically where you're living, it may have an impact. So it's complicated, right? It's not just all checkity check good or minusy minus bad. It's much more complicated. As I said, even I felt a little weird and vulnerable about talking about my gender and identity and expression, even though I've done it a million times. I'm comfortably out. But you know, sometimes it can hit you in ways that you don't even necessarily anticipate. So take care of yourself while you're doing the activity or exercise too, I would say, just as a.
Hey guys, it's Anisha. I'm in Kelowna, co-leader for NP Kelowna. I'm excited to kind of go back over everything we talked about last time.
Hey everyone, I'm Scott Earl. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a co-leader in NP Austin.
Hi, my name is Sakatar. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. I'm from Los Angeles, but I currently live in Columbus, leading November Project Columbus.
Hello again. This is Emily. I use she, her pronouns from Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, co-leader here at MSP.
So last time we recorded an introduction session where we learned a little bit more about identity exercise, what it is, why it's important, how to do it. So DA and Somi walk us through kind of facilitation of this exercise, why it's important, questions that the leaders may have found out, etc.
Oftentimes when we do activities, particularly if you identify as a white person, you will often be like, well, this is what I thought about the activity. Thinky, all up in the brain area. I would like to ask all of the folks on this call, if you identify as a person of color or a white person, more about starting out about thinking about how you felt while you were doing the activity, more of the heart space instead of the brain space. Would somebody be willing to be the bravest person and start and talk about how you felt while you were doing this activity? And then maybe we could do a round of feelings for a minute.
I can start. I felt actually really good. It was really interesting and I think eye-opening to kind of go through all of the different identities. And actually, Emily and I had talked about you know, giving an actual number to these things, like, you know, you are aware of it, but to give it a real number, it was a really interesting feeling for sure.
To kind of dovetail off what Anisha said, it felt really interesting to think about, like, being someone who is white. I don't have to think about a lot of the like what's the importance. And I'm identify as heterosexual as well, so it's like I've never had to think about what's the importance of my heterosexuality. You know, like I was like, well, I guess it, you know, like that was a question that I've never had to ponder. So Anisha and I talked a lot about, you know, some of those categories where we fall into like the quote unquote what society calls like the societal norm. Like we've never even had to think about how important is that to me.
Like a lot of people, I think I probably most identify with things that are most traumatic, I guess. So I thought it was like a really great exercise. I don't know if I necessarily was happy during my exercise. I think that a lot of the things that I went through that were especially important to me were areas in which there were some, not necessarily negative feelings, but hurt feelings, I guess. Yeah, so just trying to figure out like where I fit into everything, I think was a good exercise. I didn't feel awesome though.
Yeah, I think +1 to everything that everyone has said. And I think recently-ish, especially with the current events happening, we've been thinking a lot about race and gender and sexual orientation. These are things I think about more often, especially now as we have these conversations. But then looking at things even like language and my ability to speak English without an accent, or it's my, you know, I feel comfortable in the language, it's my first language, things like national origin. These are just things that maybe are sometimes entwined with their identities, but calling them out specifically was really enlightening and helpful. And I think also figuring out what wasn't part of this grid, but it's parts of our identities that really kind of color in who we are and how we see the world. So it was really fun exercise, but also to reflect with a partner on that as well.
I appreciate all of your comments and sharing some of the feelings that were coming up. And I think that some of what you've shared is not uncommon when we're starting to debrief this, that the parts that we might have some privilege in, and this is the first time for us to be able to kind of engage in this activity, kind of rating the importance and rating how it's regarded. That we tend to not think about the ones that we might have privilege. And so that there's a correlation sometimes there that I know that some of you spoke to. And then also sometimes the pain that comes with looking at some of these identities, especially knowing that that's not something that's happened in the past, like that is current experience, lived experience for folks, and the pain, and that's why we put that safety there too. So that if any of you kind of in the NP world are starting to engage in this activity and want to take a break or don't want to, that's completely okay. And that's what we want you to do, because that is part of taking care of yourself and acknowledging that there's a lot of bravery and courage when you're starting to step into something that there is potentially trauma, hurt, impact. So thank you for all of you for engaging in this activity.
Yeah, I think it is really important to recognize that places where you do have trauma you're going to have certain feelings around that are going to be ones that you have to, we don't want to re-traumatize you through this activity, but recognizing that some of these identities will bring up past pain or even quite recent pain around things that might have happened to you. Having done this activity many times myself, I always know that the salient identities that I hold are ones that I have pride around, obviously around my queerness and my non-binary transness, but also there's been some negative impacts around how others have seen me and how I've been treated around those. And so those are more salient to me, but also can be more painful as well. So did you learn new things about yourself while you were processing through this activity, either on your own or with your partner as you were chatting about it?
I think for me, of just kind of what Anisha said earlier too, of like actually putting a number with the importance and recognizing like how important something, like there are some on here that I put 10s for importance because it really is important. And then somewhere I was like, well, it's part of who I am. It's part of my identity, but I don't feel tied to it. Or some that I guess there were also a couple where I was like, I wish I could change this. Like the fact, for example, that English is the only language that I speak. You know, I'm very, very fortunate to be fluent and there's privilege that comes with that, but I wish I spoke another language and that was something that was a part of my life. So, you know, putting a lower importance to that as well. So kind of learning like where that number actually lined up and quantifying some of that.
Kind of going off of what Emily said, in terms of like quantifying how important things were, one of the things that I kind of ran into trouble with was trying to balance between like how important this is necessarily to my identity versus like how important this is in society. Because although those things are like two separate things, I really feel like they interact with each other so often that even if it's like, you know, for example, just being a part of the norm, so being white, it's like, okay, how important is that to my identity? Like the way that I move about life and the way that I interact with people in society, I think that affects, like my race affects that very, very highly.
Can I ask just a sidebar question about names in North America, right? So not to single out Emily and Scott, but I guess I am. So those are sort of what I would describe as like comfortably North American kinds of names. Some of the folks who are currently on this video call, and DA is like, well, that's weird. Why are you a district attorney? So I get some of that kind of ha-ha jokey sort ofness about using my initials, and I might have to explain I'm not a district attorney. So I have to go down a road there as well. But for the rest of the folks, in terms of North America and your names, we didn't ask that question on the activity exercise, but did you think about that, or has that come up for you in ways that are relevant to this identity exercise?
Yes. Obviously, you're right. Like, it wasn't necessarily asked in the identity exercise, but it's something that I interact with every single day, where I think it's probably a similar experience that you have, DA, in terms of like, you have to go into a whole thing, especially because I am white and very white appearing. And so I always get the questions about my name, which then, you know, like, where is it from? Like, where are you from? Where's your family from? And so then I end up going into, like, you know, 20-minute conversations about where I grew up, who my parents were, like the community that I was raised in. And that's not always something that I want to get into, because like a lot of, you know, like most people, you know, like your childhood experience is somewhat personal. So I go through, you know, do I lie to people? You know, for a long time I was like, maybe I'll just, you know, I had a nickname and I hated the nickname, but I was like, you know, it's just easier for people. And then when I got into college, you know, I had a few friends that were like, no, like, there's no need for you to like change who you are just to make it easier to be around other people. Sometimes I wish that it wasn't so difficult, and it wasn't something that I had to interact with every day. But I'm also grateful for it, and I'm grateful for the experiences that it's put me in.
Yeah, to kind of go back to the actual grid, I found it interesting to think about when we were scaling the regard in society based on where, like, kind of what community we're in. So like, I was really lucky to be in a community where, I don't want to say like a lot of things didn't matter, but it was, you know, like subconsciously maybe, like it wasn't as pronounced as in other communities. So to rank it in regard of like, you know, how does society feel about this, I had to really break it down and think about like, okay, like a world society aspect, or like my immediate like friend group and social society. Like, so that was really interesting to have to kind of really break that down and think about where I fit and like the amount of privilege that I get just based on who I'm surrounded by.
A couple of things that I want to add to what people have shared is I too have gotten that pause, you know, all growing up through elementary school, like they're reading off the attendance and I'm seeing some smiles already. They're like, oh, you know, there's Ian, there's Jeff, and then they pause and they look around the room, and then you're like, oh, that's me. I know you don't, you know, I don't know how much you want to try, how much you're gonna butcher this. And so, and kind of speaking to what you were saying, Saktars, like that emotional labor that comes with kind of explaining who you are, or that othering that naturally happens, and how much weight that is in small interactions that we sometimes have to carry that other people might not have to if it's a name that is practiced or more familiar to folks. And then going off of what you said, Anisha, that sometimes thinking about the larger context, also, but then also acknowledging that if you have a community where some safety has been established and is present, it's, you know, you have to think about it kind of within those nuances of like, what's it like in my immediate community that I've created that is making me feel safe and secure across some of these things versus the larger world. And so
thanks for sharing. Yeah, I mean, so again, it's one of those things where if you don't have to think about it because you have a name that's in North America, sort of Western type name, as Somya said, with the roll call of Jeff and Ian and Susie and whatever, Emily, it's, you know, that's uncomplicated. But also we know worldwide, again, we know that NP is a global movement. People move around, right, between cultures. And so if you know, depending on where you're positioned at any given time, your name may be simple if you're in the majority and everybody knows what it is, and it maybe get much more complicated if you're in a new place where it seems like, yeah, you've brought a different kind of name to the table and what that means, and having conversations with the people around you. So thank you for being willing to contemplate that for a minute. So did you all manage to get a chance to get together as pairs and chit chat with each other about your grids? And if so, if it's comfortable for you to talk about either your own experience or your partner's experience. Were there things that you learned about the other person that you would like to share with us?
I'll go first. I really enjoyed talking with Scott. So we kind of started the conversation off about like what identities were most important to us. And I thought that he had like a really interesting take on how like one of how like one identity that was like most important to him then kind of trickled down to actually affect like all of the other identities, where if you would have asked just very specifically about each identity, I think that the answers would be very different, especially like based on what community you're in, or how different identities kind of shape the way you think about yourself in other aspects. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and maybe I could expand on that too. So like being gay for me is like trickles into a lot of other identities. So with gender, right, being born male, like that affords so much privilege, but it also being gay as a man, I think associates that with different things. I grew up with 5 brothers who are all straight. I have a weird relationship with other men sometimes, especially in the athletic space, where like that was always a triggering space growing up. And now I'm leading November Project, which has a lot of privilege as a co-leader, but I'm also, as far as I know, one of fewer, queer co-leaders. So even in that space, it's kind of a weird space to negotiate sometimes, with being like one of the few gay people who are also helping lead this movement. And then there's just other, like everything else kind of trickled into with body. I forget the exact category name. Let me just bring that up here. Physical appearance, right? I would say I'm pretty physically fit, but there's also a lot of stigma around body image in at least the gay male community I can speak to. So that's affected the way I think about my own body and my mental health around that. So I think just that one identity trickled into a lot of other pieces, but I still recognize there's a lot of privilege in a lot of those identities as well. And I think I reflected a lot on that in terms of like sorry, I'm pulling up my grid, so I'm speaking to this. There's one about a parent. So I think I can definitely code switch with being gay. And especially as I've moved to the South in Texas, Austin's very welcoming. You leave an hour outside of Austin, my voice gets deeper. I'm not holding my partner's hand in public. There's just a lot of things I turn off. And I think that affords me privilege as well. But then there's also times where I'm like, like people not knowing I'm gay all the time means I have to come out all the time. And that is taxing sometimes. And there's still times where I don't feel fully comfortable in a situation talking about it, or, when I do come out, someone doesn't know how to interact or engage with that. So there's still that kind of funkiness around that. I thought it was really interesting to reflect on that piece and still recognize the privilege of being cisgender, of being male, of being white, but then also seeing how that one piece kind of affected other identities. So I think we had a great conversation around that and had similar kind of understandings of how certain pieces can really influence other parts of your identity as well.
I think, Scott, that you shared a lot of kind of amazing terms that sometimes people will talk about. So you mentioned kind of how your sexuality intersects with different components of who you are. And so when we talk about intersectionality, and some of you might be hearing that word a lot, it's really how does it intersect with other pieces of who you are, and how much oppression and privilege is associated with those intersections. And so it is like the crossings of privilege and intersection depending on these different identities. The other thing that you mentioned, Scott, is around code switching. And so some people who may be watching this might not be familiar with that. So, and this isn't just to you, Scott, but does anybody here know or want to share what the definition of code switching is?
Take a stab at that, I guess, or at least my understanding. And I love the podcast Code Switch, so I hope I can explain it to some degree. But I think I would say there's a common, when we looked at the regard aspect, there's certain things that are regarded more favorably, right? Whiteness, maleness, heterosexuality, being cisgender, having mastery of English. So sometimes if we do not match the identity, you might code switch to kind of conform to what is expected or favored by the white supremacist patriarchal society we live in. So for me, code switching means acting more straight because I think that might afford me certain privilege, or put me out of harm as well. Because there is sometimes where you might be in a situation where you are afforded, or where you are putting yourself in harm's way by being not part of that preferred identity. So that's my take. I would love to hear a more precise definition if there's one that you can offer.
That was great, Scott. And I also love Code Switch, so I hope that Jean and Shireen are watching this. They probably are. I'm sure, positive. But that was a really great example about how apparent or visible, are there any markers associated with different identities? And if you are aware of how it's regarded, sometimes people have to kind of turn it off and on, and turn on and off parts of who they are, to escape harm, escape trauma, to minimize oppression. So you did a really great job explaining that.
So just to kind of dovetail off what Scott was saying, when I was thinking about like the societal regard for being a woman, or for identifying as female, I was like, well, I consider a high regard because I've always lived my life as I was born female, identify as female, and I'm white. So I put high regard for like, that identity. But then I was like, but I guess also being a woman. So I think I intertwined them and wasn't able to separate them because I've always had the lived experience of being a heterosexual white woman who identifies with the sex that I was born with. So thinking a little bit about that intersectionality too. And then one thing that Anisha and I talked about, we both kind of struggled with categorizing, just in terms of what our like identity was socioeconomic class, because I'm able to make ends meet and cover my means, and I'm very, very grateful for that. But like, I don't make a lot, so like, but I also have parents who can support me if anything were to happen. And Anisha can speak to this as well. So it's like, I would say I'm maybe middle class or well off, but part of that comes because I know that if I were to lose my job or whatever happens, that I have my parents who can support me as well and would be there. So not really sure like how to categorize that as just me as an individual. And then Anisha being in school as well as like, well, I literally could not support myself on my own while I'm going through education. So like, how do I categorize my socioeconomic class versus like separating that? And can we even separate it from the generational wealth that we have as well?
I can speak to that a little bit more. So I live at home while I'm in school. So I'm like, I've never had an experience of, having to provide my own means and living on my own and having to feed myself, things like that. So to categorize my socioeconomic status was kind of difficult almost, because I'm like, well, it's my parents' socioeconomic status more than anything. It's not really mine. Like I wouldn't consider myself, like Emily said, like if I had to go and live on my own and support myself, like I wouldn't be in the same socioeconomic status as my parents. So that was definitely an interesting one that we kind of both struggled with a little bit.
Yeah, and I think in a North American context, class is often sort of invisible, right? That the way we talk about socioeconomic status or class is like, oh well, that's a thing from the Industrial Revolution, or that's a weird British thing. It doesn't pertain to North America, but it does. And it's often intertwined with other identities as well, right? And so people, again, make certain presumptions about your socioeconomic status, often because of your educational level, or because of how you're racialized, or because of where you live, or because of how you dress, right? All of these things are kind of intertwined with how people read you, judge you, perceive your socioeconomic status. Like for me, that's a real salient thing because I grew up in poverty, with the social safety net of Canada, which I'm grateful for, right? So we had healthcare provided that was publicly funded, and my mother had access to some public benefits, thankfully. But then the last job I had in Wisconsin, one of my colleagues, I had bought a new suit for work because I worked in a place where sometimes we had to wear suits. And this person said to me, well, aren't you bougie? And it was like a knife went into my heart, right? I was like, oh, this really is triggering stuff for me in terms of how I've seen myself, where I'm at currently, and then how somebody would say that to me. It just was like super painful. And so again, socioeconomic status or class is complicated and intertwined with so much of our other identities that I think it can be hard to unpack and simply put a rating to on a grid, right? So thanks for sharing that.
The thing that I would also add to what everyone has shared is, like Emily, you had talked about some generational wealth. And when we talk about history of class, it is impossible, at least in the United States, and probably true for in all of kind of North America, it's impossible to talk about class without talking about race. And so because of kind of some of those historical components of building wealth and sharing that safety net and being able to do that, and like, some of you have been mentioning about how racialized class is. I read something, I cannot credit it. And so whenever this comes out, I'll hopefully be able to find where I heard this, that even the term like white trash is so racist. It's a derogatory term, saying something that about anybody, right? But the fact that we have to qualify trash with the word race, with white, but we don't do that for other races, right? Again, shows how race and class are interconnected, and how, even though it's derogatory towards white people saying white trash, it's actually also very racist toward non-white folks. And so again, kind of re-emphasizing that intergenerational component and how race and class are inextricably linked in the United States, for sure.
Any other folks want to share any observations about what the process was for the grid, in terms of what you learned about your partner, or anything else before we ask you some more questions?
One other thing that I wanted to share is both Anisha and I, when we were thinking about ethnicity and culture, neither of us feel overly tied to our ancestors, because we're, a couple generations, maybe removed from the, where our ancestors are from. So both of us, when we asked about ethnicity culture, we're like, well, Anisha was saying like Canadian / Western Canadian. And for me, my identity is like Minnesotan, and or American, but then more importantly, Minnesotan, because we have, and Anisha was saying too, like, we've got a really strong, like, you're Minnesotan, like, you're from the North, you're tough, like, especially even Minneapolis, St. Paul, like, part of my culture is being from Minneapolis, not from St. Paul. So it's like, I find a lot more of culture coming from the context that I'm currently surrounded by, as opposed to my ancestors. And Anisha felt similarly as well with her Canadian.
It's exactly the same thing. Yeah, Emily and I talked about, like I'm Indian, like that's my ancestry, but I don't feel connected to that. I was born here. My parents came here when they were very young, so they grew up here. So I just, like, I don't have a very strong tie to that. So like when someone asks me, like, what culture are you, or where are you from? I'm Canadian. That's my answer, right? So, and I think as well, like, how Emily had talked about, being Minnesotan and things like that, like there is definitely a different culture being from like Western Canada versus like Toronto area, Eastern Canada. Like it's a very different, like, we do more hiking and outdoors things, and that's a city. And like, so that was interesting to have to separate out. So
Anisha, you talking about sort of the outdoorsiness of Western Canadians, like, yes, this is part of kind of the culture of being in British Columbia or Alberta in particular, because that's where we are, but also the complications of living on land that has long been occupied by Indigenous peoples, that then settlers and new Canadians come to and occupy and take possession of ways that are very complicated, right? So navigating what the land, and I'm sort of thinking a little bit about this too, because I'm teaching a course starting soon that talks about Canadian identity specifically, and who feels like they have ownership of it, because, it's complicated having a country where you've got people who identify as Indigenous peoples, people who identify as settlers, or might not identify as settlers, but people who are real Canadians. And then there are new Canadians or newcomers to Canada who then would place themselves in different. So it's the complications of being in a place like, again, the US or Canada, where you've got all kinds of different identities of folks living on the same land, but considering the first peoples who are here, or not considering the first peoples who are here.
I think that's a really good point. And I also kind of had a reflection, how everything we've talked about, everything goes back to race. Everything is so intersected with that. And there's, I was born here. I'm the same amount of Canadian as a lot of my white friends, but there are times that I feel like I'm not entitled to, be as patriotic, I guess, or, cheer on Canadian teams or things like that. Like, it's almost like, no, I'm not I'm not as privileged to be able to do that just because, you know, I look different. I was born here too. They were born here too. Nothing else is different, but that intersection was interesting to kind of reflect on.
I also appreciate the, you know, kind of the sense of pride that sometimes comes from being part of a specific geographic location. I know that a lot of like, you know, there's a few Midwest people here who like live in Midwest spaces. And so if you go to another Midwest place, there's a lot of pride that comes from, you know, what is associated with that area, the weather that you're able to handle, you know, some of that. And so there's a, you know, I think that that's also a testament to how some of our identities bring us so much joy. And we like connect it to some of our personal characteristics. Like I am this way because of, so I'm so appreciative of you sharing that.
I want to talk maybe a little bit about not what the opposite of that looks like, but kind of what DA was talking about in terms of like when somebody makes assumptions about you. And like I am definitely one of those people that I get like that knee-jerk reaction where I'm like, you know nothing about me. Don't make these assumptions. Where again, I'm very white appearing because I am white, but I was raised by a community that wasn't white. And so like I was born in America, but like the culture that I identify with is like so far from white. Including like the language and the culture and the religion. And so, and I also, like I grew up in a single parent household, you know, and we definitely like struggled to get by. So I definitely have difficulty not being mad when people make assumptions about me, because I mean, like if you look at it, and if you look at like what the average white woman looks like and like what privileges are afforded, because class, socioeconomic status, wealth, privilege is so tied to race. I think it's fair to make the assumption about, I don't know, it's not fair. I mean, like we shouldn't be making assumptions about people based on their race, but it's something that happens.
You are spot on, Sakatar, that like just like patriarchy doesn't only negatively impact women, it impacts all genders, right? Same thing around racism, that it kind of superimposes a unilateral monolithic story about somebody based on this arbitrary socially constructed identity. And so our construct, right? And so you're spot on that those assumptions then you're also pushing back on a kind of a common narrative that's not true, not only you, others, right? And so I'm so appreciative of that because people see something as salient, then they assume all these things about you. So thank you for sharing that.
I guess I could, because we're all kind of in an open space, share a bit more too about the changing levels of identity as time evolves almost, and like the value or the importance. And that was a really interesting reflection for me, because even things like sexuality, like being gay in 2020 is a lot easier, I think, than being gay when I was 2009 when I was coming out in college, right? Like that's completely changed, but it also got harder when I moved from DC to Texas. So it's just been interesting over time. And now I'm in a relationship where I'm dating an Indian person who is very religious, and I'm white and not religious. So like have been finally in rooms where I'm the only white person, and that was never a thing for me. So I've been thinking more about race in that. I've been thinking more about my religion. I've been thinking more about some of these identities that weren't always super important. So I just thought it was really interesting to see how value changes, how importance changes, the comfort level changes over time as we assume different identities. And it just kind of it speaks to the complexity of intersectionality for both good and bad, and also, I guess, just how it relates to specific scenarios. So I think that was one thing that Sakatar and I talked a little bit about in our conversation.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Scott was saying, just in terms of like, not just in terms of how important identities are, like in certain times in your life, like high school, college, after college, you know, when you're getting married, when you have kids, like, etc. But also just like the day and age that we live in. And so like for a long time, like I was closeted, identify as queer. And so because it wasn't something, like there was no space in which to come out of. Like, I think that obviously there are some like really intensely strong people that are able to just like really be strong in their identity without any role models or without anyone around them to come out to. But it was something that I was just like, all right, we're just going to deal with this later. This is going to be a future problem. And so then it was, I mean, not that it was a problem, but that it was something that like I dealt with later, and then, or not dealt with, but came to terms with, and then also accepted, and then also had pride in.
Another one that Emily and I talked about that changes all the time was age. We thought that was kind of an interesting one, because like, how do you rank the importance of being an age in that year, right? Like, it's going to change. Like, how much do I care that I'm 21? Or like, how much does society care that I'm 21, right? So that was an interesting one, and to kind of reflect on how that affects you. Like, personally, I was always mature for my age, I guess, and to, you know, I would have conversations with adults and they would be like, oh, you're just a kid. Like, you know, I would get that kind of reaction from people. But then around people my age, I don't necessarily enjoy doing things that regular 21-year-olds do. So then I am kind of stuck in the middle of that. So to kind of, you know, break that down and see, you know, how important is it that I act my age, so to say, right? And how important is that to me and to society? So that was an interesting one for sure.
Yeah, that's one of those categories of, like you said, Anisha, shifts over time. And so as someone who's 51, I can tell you that, you know, being in advanced middle age, as I describe it, there's interesting ways that people now react to me, or what they expect of me, or all of a sudden now having a position in the queer community as being like a queer elder is a little funny. I mean, I like it. I like being able to do that kind of, and my argument is I learn as much from queer youth or more than they would learn from me. But this intergenerational mentorship that's possible between, you know, somebody who's my age and somebody who's much younger offers beautiful possibilities, I think, for both sets of things. But yeah, you know, I hear older people say all the time, well, I still think of myself as being 25, even though I'm whatever age, right? Because how we view age in our culture and society, obviously, again, that varies across countries and across cultures. But in the current context that we're living in, and for the majority of us in North America, it's not necessarily valued to see aging as a positive, affirmative gathering of wisdom. It's sort of like, oh, that's sad, now you're wrinkly and you won't be able to run as fast.
You know, yeah, aging is not necessarily like looked highly upon in Western society, but at the same time, you know, being someone in their 20s trying to be taken seriously, you know, in work and in other areas of life, it's just, I mean, I work at an organization that it's a great, wonderful nonprofit organization. I love it, but it has really, really internalized patriarchy. And it's something that we're working to deal with. And there are some people on staff who just kind of give myself and the other younger female staff members just the little work, you know, the things that they don't want to deal with, and they just put it on our plates. But then they also don't come to, you know, they don't give credit to the ideas that we bring to the table. So then there's also that idea of age being like, yeah, like, oh, I'm 27, it's great, it's wonderful, you know, I'm young, I'm carefree, and they add the negativity of aging. And, you know, when you hit 30, it's like, oh, you're 30. But at the same time, it's like, well, maybe I want to be 30 so that people will start giving me more credit for the work that I'm doing and acknowledging what I can bring to the table too.
Emily said something that I thought was important, and also something that relates to NP. She was talking about how, you know, wanting to be older so that it's like you're more respected, or, you know, maybe being a woman in a workplace, or, you know, otherwise. And I think that obviously, like, things are changing, but Scott and I talked a little bit about this in terms of the privilege of being able-bodied, the privilege of being young, the privilege of, you know, all of the things that I think that, you know, being white, honestly, in November Project. So I think that, you know, for a long time, there was this bro culture of, you know, be the fastest, you know, look like this or be like this. And Scott and I were talking about that if we were going to try to be leaders, I don't actually know how long ago it was, but a certain amount of years ago, we wouldn't make the cut at all. Like, I don't race a lot of things. Obviously, I'm not obese. I'm a little overweight, but it's the fact that I'm not the fastest person in my crew. Not even, I'm maybe in the middle, but it's like I started this because I wanted to create a community, and I wanted to have positive people around me. But just kind of looking at the atmosphere of accepting and validating more individuals, because I think that Emily's experience is not unique in any sense. Like, I think that a lot of people really feel that way. And I think that a lot of people feel that way in NP, like in terms of their race, in terms of their age, in terms of their gender, in terms of their queerness, in terms of their able-bodiedness.
I mean, I can, this isn't my show, but I can speak a little bit to the able-bodiedness piece, because when I moved to Madison, I was having some chronic issues with my left foot, left leg. It wasn't even really clear. And so the reason I joined November Project is, I can't be a traditional runner anymore. Like, if people do go on a run, they're just going to leave me. Whereas the November Project, they'll just lap me 47 times but they'll come back to me, right? And so I was always at the back of the pack. I was always one of the last people, but that community accepted me. I was friends with some of the fast people who lapped me 47 times, probably because we had 47 times for them to say hi as they lapped me. I mean, eventually I got a diagnosis of young onset Parkinson's disease, but for me, it was not a conscious space where I could find acceptance, because that wasn't really what I was looking for, and I didn't know I was looking for that. But that was the plus of November Project as a space where it was like, okay, we're working out in this space, and people won't just leave me behind. So that was great. It facilitated my ability to keep working out until I, could get a diagnosis and get some resolution. But I did have a queer friend of mine say to me in Madison, because I knew them and we operated in the same spaces, is NP queer friendly? And I was like, well, I would say there's some people who are queer like me in the group. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a space where there's a lot of consciousness around queer identity. And so I was like, eh. So yeah, I think obviously that each city, each group, all of that personality. But yeah, I think in terms of the goodwill of wanting to accept people, obviously this organization has we're doing the work, right? We're trying to do that work.
Maybe I could share something about, I know Sakatar talked a little bit about the requirements for being a leader at some point, which have been stripped away. And I think we've reflected on that a lot, but I think one of them was like, if you can run a half marathon under an hour and 30 minutes. And I was like, okay, I'm doing 1:35. It was like a goal I had in my mind. So I'm like, I would love to be a leader one day. And I'm glad it got stripped away, because I don't think I've ever hit under 1:30. But one thing that was important to me was like, I saw there weren't a lot of queer leaders, and I thought I have a perspective to share because of that. And I don't know, there's like a gratefulness for being queer, especially being, I don't know, it sounds ignorant, but like being like a white cisgender man. Like, I like having something that has made me really think about what oppression feels like. I'm of course benefit so much from the other privileges, but I've really been able to see in other ways, like I have to experience this kind of life where I can't be my full self sometimes because of X, Y, Z. So I've tried to take a lot of that into my role as a leader. And that's why I've been more grateful to see like consciousness amongst our leaders, but also more diversity in different ways in our leadership as well, and trying to learn from each other how to tap into each other's experiences to make our own cities better. And like another example with that is like a few years ago, I got diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and I'm in mostly remission now. But for me, whenever we pick a location, I'm like, where is the nearest bathroom? Is there a bathroom nearby? And that's something that I don't think a lot of us think about. But like, there was a time in DC, I had to run to a Whole Foods that was a mile away because I really needed to go to the bathroom. And it's just something that like, I would never have thought of that if I didn't have this thing happen to me. So I think it's great that we can learn from each other from these different identities, especially spaces where we might not be in the privileged position. And still, when we talk about able-bodiedness, that's the only thing I have going on. There are other things as a leader I'm not conscious of, I would like to become more conscious of, to be more welcoming and inclusive to other folks with different disabilities.
I'm really grateful for some of the change in rhetoric at November Project around ableness and fitness level. But it's definitely something when, when we're not in person, but when we are in person again, like I see people, especially during this time of COVID when we're not together, of trying, like comparing what they're doing during COVID to what other people in November Project are doing too, like, of pushing themselves and creating all these crazy fun challenges. And I've partaken in it as well. But I feel like there is, in the whole fitness community, there's just this like need and desire to push yourself, and like, if someone else can do it, I can do it too. And it doesn't, like, what's our bar for gauging what's too far? And I think really recognizing and lifting up people who just show up, but also who know when to just be like, I'm good. Like this was a really great workout, a really great experience, but I don't need to do that last rep. Like, that's fine. And I really want to work on lifting that up, because that's something that I've seen have very negative consequences in NP and outside of NP as well.
Kind of elevate what you've just said, Emily, or kind of amplify that, but how we define what wellness is, how we define what health is rooted in white supremacy. And so part of like, just do more. And like, yes, of course we know that part of the biology of increasing muscle and getting faster is pushing ourselves, but knowing our limits and modeling those limits, and people working out to the point of injury is, again, how is that connected to health? How do we define health and wellness? That is, and we know that there's a lot of experts who are talking about how health is defined is kind of in white terms, and how it's kind of, so how do we deconstruct that? So I so appreciate you bringing that up.
I really liked what you said in terms of like recognizing limits and stopping before that. But I also think that it is, in every sense of the term, diversity is important. But I also think that like diversifying what limits are accepted into these kinds of spaces. And so like stopping, like not just like, stopping a little bit early, but like stopping like a lot early and creating those boundaries. I think that currently is something that we're working on. I don't know that, obviously I don't know every city, but I think that that's something, like, for example, I think that what Emily was talking about in terms of like, comparing yourself to the people around you, or like in November Project, I think has been interesting, at least in Columbus, because, people are doing, no sleep relays, or, they're doing 50 milers, or, all of these things, which is awesome. And I think that like that upper end of the spectrum should also be included. But I also know, like, I'm somebody with a mental illness. And so like looking, especially during quarantine, during COVID, during all of these times, some of those things like aren't attainable for me. And so sometimes I'm like, who wants to do like a 2-mile challenge? You know what I mean? So like kind of trying to create the space for the people that aren't capable of hanging with the boys,
This is so helpful to reflect on, especially as we're framing this as like, in terms of like being white supremacist and having, I think, a lot of patriarchal base. And I'm speaking now as a white man, but there's been so many times where I've also been like, done something that I didn't think I could do because I felt encouraged and pushed. So I think it's like, how do we find that really strong balance of like, your personal boundaries are so important and you should never push yourself more than you can, but also know that you can do more than you sometimes think. And I wonder how to balance that appropriately, because I've seen so many people who ran their first 6K when we did a Sunrise 6K, or said that was not possible and then they did it. But I also don't want someone to run that and they felt forced to do it and they got injured, right? So I wonder what that balance is for us as leaders. Not just in NP. I think this extends to a lot of other fitness community and other spaces. So I think it's just something really helpful to reflect on as we move forward. Like, how do we encourage people, but also take their identities and wellness as a broader sphere into consideration?
Yeah, like I 100%, what is that balance? Because there's a lot of growth that can come from challenging yourself and pushing yourself. but then you are in the hospital or something happens, and it's like that hindsight's 2020. But I think what Satkar said too about like we are co-leaders and we're in this role for a reason. We decided to step into it. So putting it out there, like saying, hey, I'm going for a 2-mile run. Who wants, like, yeah, you've got someone posting on the social page saying like, let's do 30 stair reps, this, whatever it is, whatever challenge they come up with. But then, having Satkar's voice or someone else saying, I'm going to go for a 2-mile run or a walk, who wants to join me for an afternoon walk, and making those opportunities available so no one feels like they need to test or push their limits.
We've talked a little bit around white supremacy culture, and I think we're going to do more of that. So we don't want to just like put it out there and be like, bye, whatever. We will talk more about the idea of white supremacy culture. And something as simple as like, maybe it was you and me, Somya, the other day, I was talking about checklists. I love a to-do list or a checklist of tasks. And I was like, yeah, that's a white supremacy culture thing. Like, you have to be productive. You have to keep working. You've got to get all the things done. You have to be successful. And especially like Satkar, I also have depression and anxiety particularly anxiety that I've lived with my whole life too. And that also sort of feeds into it's got to get done, and it's got to get done in a perfect way. And if it doesn't, I'm a terrible person. So, some of that around like expectations for self too can be like, again, yes, checklists and to-do lists are fine, but also monitoring how that's going to impact you if it is a mental health challenge around anxiety, that you shouldn't judge your own worth as a human based on how many things you got done today.
I mean, I'll speak to that as well. Like, I'm someone, same thing, like I like to be productive, and that is, unfortunately mostly driven by my anxiety, that if I'm not doing something, I'm like, oh my God, I need to be doing something right now. And I think it's interesting because there is a lot in terms of, regard in society that being an individual like that is highly regarded. And a lot of people really appreciate that, you get things done and la, 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 la. And like someone, for example, like my brother is very much the opposite. And in some ways, I very much wish I was like that, where it's not, you're not putting that emotional and mental strain on yourself to be able to do these things. And, yeah, I get some privilege for being able to be highly regarded for the way I, run my life, but then at the same time, at what cost, right? So it's like that kind of balancing act that we were talking about. And I think that's really important to kind of look at. And I don't think a lot of people consider that aspect in terms of like ableness. Like I might, I look like I'm able, and I am able, but, at what cost, right?
And I think that's important to lift up too, about what society views as important. Then we shape our identities off of that too. As someone who struggled with body image issues, when I was thinking about like, what does size and appearance mean to me? Well, unfortunately, I put that as a 10 because like, I have done things that I should not do to my body so that I'm looking the way that society tells me to. But then I get the comments of, oh, you look so great, or oh, you're so thin, you look wonderful. And I'm like, that perpetuates, like with Anisha was saying of, oh, how great you're getting all this stuff done, you're so productive. It's looked, very highly on by society, but then perpetuates some of the underlying issues as well. So
I kind of feel like that goes back to what Somya was talking about in terms of like how racism or sexism or any kind of ism really affects everybody. And so it's like, if you're looking at Anisha and you're talking about her productivity, or you're talking about Emily and you're talking about her physique or physical appearances, that affects everybody. But then I also think that in ways that are very apparent in November Project, that I think, this is just my opinion, I think that this affects people of color so much that they don't even come back. So that they come, but because of the kind of white supremacist expectations that, whether explicitly or not, are present within this organization, I think that makes people feel uncomfortable. And this is true like in any large institution, whether it's like you're going to school or it's, you know, you're interviewing for a job or anything like that. I think that these white supremacist expectations really hinder everybody. And like most things, disproportionately affect people of color.
I want to thank, you know, the people who are just sharing at the very end about around eating challenges and body image and anxiety, and just disclosing that they had, you know, they're working through a mental health challenge or living with that. We know that there's a lot of stigma and kind of unseenness around experiencing a mental health challenge. So thank you for sharing that and sharing how it intersects with this world, you know, with November Project. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I feel like I know all of you a little bit better now, and I feel privileged that you were willing to let me into your space and share these things with me. So thank you for being willing to do that.